If one morning you overheard the enemy talking about movie nights and mail delivery, completely unaware that a storm of steel and fire was about to descend upon them, how would you feel? This is what Seaman Second Class Jerry Nakamura experienced as he sat in the Combat Information Center of the USS Essex, translating intercepted Japanese radio chatter. His hands shook and tears rolled down his cheeks. "They do not know we are coming," he whispered, the weight of the moment pressing into every syllable. For those who heard his words, it was a chilling reminder. The enemy was unprepared, but history was about to be rewritten. It was the dawn of February 17th, 1944. In the Central Pacific, darkness still cloaked the horizon, but an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen was moving swiftly toward Truk Lagoon. Task Force 58, under Admiral Raymond Spruance and Vice Admiral Marc Mitscher, brought with it 15 aircraft carriers, 7 battleships, and more than 900 combat aircraft. This would not be just another raid, not just another island conquest. This was the moment the United States Navy would prove that the age of battleships was ending and a new form of warfare, one built on flight decks that never slept, was rising to decide the fate of empires. 6 months before the American fleet appeared off Truk Lagoon, the Central Pacific seemed to belong entirely to Japan. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's carefully built defensive perimeter stretched like an iron chain across thousands of miles. From the Aleutian Islands in the far north to the Solomons in the south, and anchored firmly by the fortress of Truk in the Caroline Islands, the Japanese believed they had forged an unbreakable shield. American intelligence officers called Truk the Gibraltar of the Pacific. It was more than a base. It was a floating empire of anchorages, airfields, supply depots, and hidden batteries. From here, Japanese naval and air forces could lash out at any attempt to breach their line. The strategy was simple. Make every island an unsinkable aircraft carrier, bristling with coral runways and fortified gun positions. Japanese planners calculated with grim certainty. If the Americans tried to storm this chain, they would bleed themselves dry. The lesson of Tarawa loomed large. In November 1943, over 1,000 Marines were killed and more than 2,000 wounded in just 3 days of fighting on an atoll barely larger than the National Mall in Washington. If such a price was paid for one small island, what would be the cost of advancing through hundreds of such fortresses all the way to Japan? It was here that Japan made its fatal miscalculation. They underestimated the true scale of American industry, and they failed to grasp how naval aviation itself was changing. When the Essex-class aircraft carriers began to arrive in late 1943, they were more than steel hulls and long flight decks. They were factories, floating industrial complexes designed to manufacture destruction on a scale the world had never seen. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, Air Group Commander aboard the USS Essex, understood this truth better than most. To his squadron, he explained, "The Japanese think of carriers as battleships with wings. They strike once and then they retreat. But we are not like that. We are factories. We never stop." The numbers proved him right. Each Essex-class carrier carried close to 90 aircraft, supported by elevators that could move planes from hangar to deck in 90 seconds. Steam catapults hurled fully loaded Hellcats and Avengers into the sky every 30 seconds. Armor protection, redundant damage control systems, and rapid fueling and rearming procedures allowed the ships to sustain combat indefinitely. Even more revolutionary was their doctrine. No longer would carriers fight as lone wolves. Admiral Marc Mitscher perfected the use of task groups, 3 or 4 Essex carriers operating in a protective circle, shielded by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Together, they formed a machine that could launch strikes by day, by night, and in all weather, never allowing the enemy to catch its breath. This was not just an improvement in technology. It was a transformation in philosophy. The era of the decisive gun duel was over. The age of relentless air power had arrived. By January 1944, the revolution at sea was already on display in the Marshall Islands. At Kwajalein and Majuro, Task Force 58 struck with a tempo that stunned Japanese commanders. For 3 days before the Marines went ashore, American carriers unleashed wave after wave of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, once the architect of Pearl Harbor, watched in disbelief from his headquarters on Saipan. He had fortified Kwajalein for 2 years, placing 8,500 troops behind bunkers and coral trenches. Yet within just 4 days, the island had fallen. The defenders were crushed under a storm of bombs, shells, and relentless attacks from the sky. American Hellcats swept Japanese aircraft from the skies. Dauntless dive bombers tore apart bunkers and gun positions. Avengers struck at supply depots and fuel dumps. But what most alarmed Nagumo was not the firepower. It was the endurance. The Essex-class carriers maintained continuous air cover for days, supporting both the Marines on the beaches and the fleet offshore. One Japanese officer, Commander Ryunosuke Kusaka, summed it up with chilling honesty. They operate their carriers like we operate our airfields, but their airfields move at 30 knots, and they are guarded by battleships. We have no answer. For the Japanese, the Marshall Islands campaign was a warning. For the Americans, it was a rehearsal. The true test was still to come at Truk Lagoon. The morning of February 17, 1944, began like no other in the Pacific. At 05:30, Japanese radar on Truk Lagoon detected unidentified aircraft, but officers dismissed it. American carriers, they believed, were still hundreds of miles away in the Marshalls. No one imagined that 9 fleet carriers, supported by battleships and cruisers, had slipped silently across the ocean under strict radio silence. At 06:15, the sky erupted. 72 F-65 Hellcats roared over Truk's airfields at treetop level. The fighters came from Essex, Enterprise, Yorktown, Intrepid, and Bunker Hill, with support from light carriers. Within minutes, Japanese Zeros scrambled in confusion. Poorly trained replacements, they never stood a chance. By the end of the first 2 hours, 50 Japanese aircraft lay shattered in the sky and on the runways. Only 4 Hellcats had been lost. But this was just the beginning. Behind the fighter sweep came the heavy punch: Dauntless dive bombers, Avenger torpedo planes, and Corsair fighter bombers. Below them lay the heart of Japan's forward empire: battleships, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, transports, and submarine tenders. Lieutenant Frank Lawler of the Enterprise aimed his Dauntless at the massive Rio de Janeiro Maru, a submarine support ship. His bomb tore through the decks and detonated in the engine room. Within minutes, the vessel was gone, dragging critical supplies to the bottom. By noon, more than 20 Japanese ships had been destroyed or crippled. Fires raged across the lagoon. Smoke darkened the tropical sky. For 2 days, the Essex-class carriers kept striking, launching over 1,200 sorties. One Japanese observer, Hiroshi Suzuki, wrote bitterly in his diary, "We launch everything once, and then we are finished. The Americans launch again and again and again. Their airfields float, and they cannot be destroyed." Truk Lagoon, once the pride of Japan's Pacific defense, had become a graveyard. The victory at Truk did more than shatter Japan's fleet. It opened the path for a bold new strategy: leapfrogging across the Pacific by building American bases faster than Japan could destroy them. This was the essence of island hopping. Nowhere was this clearer than in the work of the Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees. At Tarawa in November 1943, their task had been daunting. The atoll was nothing more than coral and wreckage after 3 days of brutal fighting. Yet within 15 hours of its capture, the Seabees had cleared the runways, laid fuel lines, and made the airfield operational for American aircraft. Chief William Big Bill Morrison remembered the lesson well. At Kwajalein in February 1944, his battalion repeated the miracle. "We went from ship to shore to operational airfield in 60 hours, he recalled. In less than 3 days, the Americans had turned a fortress built over 2 years by the Japanese into a base that could launch bombers deeper into enemy territory. Each captured atoll became a stepping stone. From Tarawa to Kwajalein, from Majuro to Eniwetok, the Pacific was transformed into a vast network of American air power. Heavy B-24 Liberators struck far beyond the horizon. Medium B-25 supported invasions just days after landings. The Seabees, working under fire, had become as vital to victory as any Marine rifleman or Navy pilot. For Japan, this was a nightmare. Their fixed fortresses were crumbling, while America's moving empire of bases and carriers kept advancing. The deeper the Americans pushed into the Pacific, the clearer the contrast became between the two great fleets. Japan still clung to the doctrine of the decisive battle. Their carriers were designed for speed and aircraft capacity, but they lacked armor and damage control systems. Their pilots were brave and often skillful, but training was shortened by fuel shortages and the desperate need to replace fallen veterans. Each engagement drained them further, for their ships could not withstand punishment, and their logistics lines, stretched thin and under attack from American submarines, were collapsing. The United States had chosen a different path. The Essex-class carriers were built not only to fight, but to survive. Fires could be contained, damage repaired, and operations continued. Their logistics chain, powered by the world's largest industrial base, ensured an endless supply of planes, bombs, and fuel. Pilots were trained as professionals, drilled in teamwork and coordination, rather than relying on individual heroics. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell put it plainly. "We do not train heroes, we train professionals. A hero might shoot down 3 enemy planes and die. A professional will down one and return to fight again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next." Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most celebrated aces, admitted the truth from the other side. "We fought for glory, but the Americans fought like a machine. You cannot defeat a machine with courage alone." This difference, spirit against system, desperation against endurance, meant only one outcome. The Americans would grind forward, step by step, while Japan could do nothing but fall back. Behind the sweeping statistics of ships sunk and aircraft destroyed were the human stories that gave the Pacific War its soul. On the USS Essex, aviation ordnance man First Class Tommy McKenna never forgot the face of Jerry Nakamura, the young Japanese-American sailor whose tears marked the beginning of Operation Hailstone. For McKenna, it was the moment he realized that war was not only about weapons, but about people caught in forces larger than themselves. Robert Chun, a Chinese-American sailor aboard the USS Yorktown, remembered the endless hours on the flight deck. "The Japanese pilots were brave," he later said, "maybe braver than us. But bravery was not enough. They attacked once, then they were done. We never stopped. When they went home, we followed." On the other side, Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, admitted his fear when facing the Hellcats over Kwajalein. "They fought as teams, not as lone men seeking glory. It was like fighting a machine, and we could not break it." Even Japanese officers, hardened by years of service, confessed their despair. Hiroshi Suzuki, who had once flown at Pearl Harbor, wrote in his diary after Truk, "Our doctrine was to strike once with all we had. The Americans struck again and again. Their carriers were floating airfields that never slept." These voices, American and Japanese alike, tell the same truth. The war was turning, and nothing could stop the momentum of the Essex-class carriers. Behind the sweeping statistics of ships sunk and aircraft destroyed were the human stories that gave the Pacific War its soul. On the USS Essex, aviation ordnanceman First Class Tommy McKenna never forgot the face of Jerry Nakamura, the young Japanese-American sailor whose tears marked the beginning of Operation Hailstone. For McKenna, it was the moment he realized that war was not only about weapons, but about people caught in forces larger than themselves. Robert Chun, a Chinese-American sailor aboard the USS Yorktown, remembered the endless hours on the flight deck. "The Japanese pilots were brave," he later said, "maybe braver than us. But bravery was not enough. They attacked once, then they were done. We never stopped. When they went home, we followed." On the other side, Saburo Sakai, Japan's most famous surviving ace, admitted his fear when facing the Hellcats over Kwajalein. "They fought as teams, not as lone men seeking glory. It was like fighting a machine, and we could not break it." Even Japanese officers, hardened by years of service, confessed their despair. Hiroshi Suzuki, who had once flown at Pearl Harbor, wrote in his diary after Truk, "Our doctrine was to strike once with all we had. The Americans struck again and again. Their carriers were floating airfields that never slept." These voices, American and Japanese alike, tell the same truth. The war was turning, and nothing could stop the momentum of the Essex-class carriers. On the morning of September 2, 1945, the USS Essex lay anchored in Tokyo Bay. Her flight deck, once alive with the thunder of engines, now stood silent, cleared for the surrender ceremony that would end the Pacific War. For the sailors who had fought from Tarawa to Truk, from the Marianas to Okinawa, the true victory was not only in that single moment, but in the long journey that had brought them there. They had built something new, not just ships or aircraft, but a way of fighting that changed the very nature of war. The Essex-class carriers had proven that endurance, organization, and industrial might could shape the destiny of nations. They had turned the vast Pacific into an American lake and written a new doctrine that would guide navies for generations. The legacy of world. War II was not only the defeat of fascism, but the revelation that mobility and sustained air power could dominate the seas. The lessons of World War II echoed in every carrier that followed, from the nuclear giants of the Cold War to the modern fleets that still patrol the oceans. And the courage of ordinary sailors who endured endless days on flight decks that never slept remains one of the enduring human stories of World War II. The carriers had done more than win a war. They had defined the future of naval power, and in doing so, they left behind a lesson for us all. Peace, justice, and freedom must be built with the same endurance that once carried men across the firestorms of the Pacific.